Chimes of midnight send the first of what are expected to be over 400,000 new cars sold in August on their way. Something approaching a quarter of all new cars this year will be sold in a single month, in a ritual not seen in other countries, but which an official government committee earlier this year announced would not change. For months, car-carrying ships have been bringing in foreign-made vehicles to be stockpiled in anticipation of this month's sales. It's the fourth year running that car sales have risen, thanks to a consumer boom which is also making a sizable dent in Britain's balance of payments. Last year, British factories made more cars than for almost a decade, and the import percentage was cut back. This year, imports are up. Figures for the first half of this year show nearly 55% of cars sold were imported. That compares with a nearly 50-50 split last year. The main difference that not so many cars were made in Ford's British factories, and the impact of the strike at the beginning of this year is still being felt.
We're still trying to get over the problems caused by the Ford strike. We had a slowdown in production at the end of last year, and I'm afraid that these pipeline stocks take so long to build up. We're still bringing in more from the continent than we have done in previous years. Something like approaching 1 in 2 Fords is now sourced from European plant for the UK marketplace.
Garage forecasts are for more than 2.1 million cars to be sold this year, but there are some fears that that could be affected by the increase in interest rates. The trade's verdict on that today: cheap credit schemes have continued in periods of high interest rates before. There's no reason why they shouldn't keep running.
And finally, Mrs.
The picture
Charlotte.
the West had of the Blackjack bomber was an artist's impression, drawn by an American intelligence expert.
Just a year ago, no Western cameraman dreamed of being allowed to take pictures like these. The Blackjack, as NATO calls it, is the very latest Soviet bomber just entering service. Like the American B-1, it has swing wings and a shape that minimizes radar reflections. The visit by US Defense Secretary Frank Carlucci to the Soviet airbase was a remarkable extension of the Soviets' new military openness. He inspected a bomber on the ground. Dwarfing the MiG fighter parked beside it, the Blackjack is over 50 meters long. Mr. Carlucci climbed inside the aircraft, which carries nuclear cruise missiles. His visit follows the one to United States military bases last month by the Soviet Chief of Staff. The Blackjack's wartime role would be to fly low over the North Pole to attack targets in the United States. Mr. Carlucci was asked if he'd learned any secrets inside the plane.
I'm not a qualified intelligence officer. I'm not a qualified observer. They let me sit in the cockpit, but I couldn't tell one instrument from another. But obviously it's a very impressive aircraft. It has considerable capability. This is not an intelligence operation. It is a chance to take a look at each other's equipment, to get to know the capabilities.
The Soviets refused to give any details of the bomber, except that it is new.
This bomber has been shown for the Western observers and the press for the first time.
Mr. Carlucci was then given a flying display by 4 MiG-29 fighters, the type the Russians will bring to the British Farnborough Air Show next month. After viewing so much Soviet technology, Mr. Carlucci developed a thirst. He chose an American invention, a bottle of cola.
Within the last hour...
Remarkable evidence of glasnost in the Soviet military. Today, Mr. Carlucci was given a spectacular display of secret Soviet hardware. The new MiG-29 fighter, a plane believed to be a match for Western fighters, a worry for the RAF, and until today, the only pictures of it were those obtained by Western intelligence. Likewise, the Blackjack, a supersonic nuclear bomber. For Mr. Carlucci, it wasn't just a chance to look at it from the runway. He was escorted inside as well, to the controls of a plane specifically designed to devastate America with nuclear weapons. The plane's long been known about to NATO, but for the Western public at least, the only pictures have been artist impressions. For Mr. Carlucci, the Blackjack must have looked almost familiar. It's suspiciously similar to America's own B-1 bomber. Today's open day, though, was no less remarkable for that.
Did you learn anything that you didn't know from intelligence?
The Blackjack? I'm not a qualified intelligence officer. I'm not a qualified observer. They let me sit in the cockpit, but I couldn't tell one instrument from another.
This bomber has been shown for the Western observers and the press for the first time.
Though the Soviet military is showing more glasnost, the Americans believe it's showing no less aggression. As they staged a mock attack, Mr. Carlucci's been telling his hosts their forces don't look as defensive as the Kremlin claims. But it's hoped today's visit may at least go some way to easing tension between the world's two largest nuclear powers.